I was standing at our kitchen window in Boulder, 7 months pregnant, watching my husband at the shooting range across the street. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to set down my water glass. The sound of gunfire echoed through our quiet neighborhood, and I watched Thomas, my husband of 18 months. The man who claimed loud noises sent him into debilitating panic attacks, laughing with his friends as he fired round after round at paper targets. For 2 years, I had tiptoed through our home. No slamming doors, no fireworks on the 4th of July, no action movies. I had learned to live in whispers and soft footsteps because I loved a man who said the war had shattered his nervous system beyond repair. And now, 7 months pregnant with our daughter, I was watching him do the one thing he swore would destroy him. I picked up my phone with trembling fingers and texted him, "Come home, now." My name is Eleanor Mitchell. I'm 61 years old now, but I'm going to tell you about the autumn I turned 31, when my entire understanding of love and truth got turned inside out. People always ask me why I stayed, why I forgave what happened. But to understand that, you need to understand who I was back then, and how desperately I was trying to escape it. In 1993, I was a social worker at the Denver VA hospital. I had been for 3 years, after burning out from a corporate HR position that paid well but hollowed me out inside. My mother, God rest her soul, could not comprehend this choice. "Eleanor Francis, you have a master's degree from Cornell," she would say, voice tight with disappointment. "You're 31 years old, unmarried, working with troubled veterans for a third of what you could be making. When are you going to settle down? Have a real career? Find a good man?" My younger sister Rebecca had married at 25. My older sister Margaret at 27. Both had children, houses in good school districts, husbands with stable jobs. And then there was me, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, coming home exhausted from the VA, eating dinner alone most nights. My mother would call every Sunday and somehow work in mentions of eligible men, her friend's son, the accountant, our neighbor's nephew, the dentist, anyone, really, who had a decent job and a pulse. "You're going to end up alone," she told me the Christmas before I met Thomas. We were at Rebecca's house, watching her kids open presents while my mother and I stood in the kitchen. "Independent is fine, Eleanor, but you're not getting any younger. Don't you want a family?" The truth was, I did. I wanted it desperately. But I had watched too many of my friends marry men they settled for, men who were good on paper, but who made them small and quiet and less than themselves. I had promised myself I would wait for something real. I met Thomas in March at a fundraiser for the Disabled American Veterans Organization. I was there representing the VA hospital's social work department. He was there as a speaker, a decorated Army Ranger who had served in the Gulf War and come home with severe PTSD and a mission to help other veterans transition back to civilian life. He had started a nonprofit called Second Wind Veteran Services, providing job training and mental health support. When he spoke that night, you could have heard a pin drop in that ballroom of 300 people. He talked about the invisible wounds of war, about coming home to a country that wanted you to be normal but gave you no tools to get there, about the shame of not being able to handle a car backfiring, of having panic attacks in grocery stores, of feeling like a stranger in your own life. He was honest about his struggles in a way that was both vulnerable and powerful. After his speech, I approached him to discuss a potential partnership between his nonprofit and the VA. He was tall, with dark hair graying at the temples, and the kind of weathered face that suggested someone who had seen things he could never unsee. When he shook my hand, I noticed his grip was gentle, careful, as if he was always conscious of his own strength. "Eleanor, right?" he said, glancing at my name tag. "You work with veterans at the VA?" "Social work department," I confirmed. "I think there could be a great synergy between your job training programs and our mental health services. A lot of our guys struggle with the employment piece. In my experience," he said quietly, "most civilians don't want to hire the broken ones." Something in the way he said it, not bitter, just factual, made my heart hurt. We talked for an hour that night, standing in a corner while the fundraiser went on around us. He told me about starting Second Wind from his apartment, about how his worst days made him the most qualified to help others through theirs. I told him about leaving corporate America to do work that mattered, about my mother's disapproval, about feeling like I was always defending my choices. "You know what I think?" he said as the event was winding down. "I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The world has enough people chasing money, not enough chasing purpose." He asked for my number that night. Not for the partnership, for himself. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "If you're interested in spending time with someone who can't do loud restaurants and might have to leave suddenly if things get overwhelming." Our first date was at a quiet Italian place he knew, tucked away on a side street. He had called ahead to request a corner table, away from the kitchen. Halfway through dinner, a server dropped a tray of glasses, and I watched Thomas go absolutely rigid. His face went pale, his hands gripped the edge of the table, and for a moment I thought he might bolt. I reached across and put my hand over his, not saying anything, just present. After a minute, his breathing slowed, and he looked at me with something like gratitude mixed with shame. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be," I told him. "You're here. That's what matters." I fell in love with him over the next 3 months. Real, honest, consuming love. He was brilliant and damaged and trying so hard to build something meaningful from his pain. We would meet for early dinners at quiet places. He would come to my apartment and we would talk for hours, or sometimes just sit in comfortable silence. He told me about his deployments, about losing friends, about the nightmares that still woke him up most nights. I had never felt so trusted by another human being. My mother met him in June. To my surprise, she was impressed. War hero, non-profit founder, thoughtful and polite. "Now this," she told me privately, "is a man worth your time, Eleanor. Don't let this one get away." For once, my mother and I agreed on something. Thomas proposed in August, at sunrise on Flagstaff Mountain overlooking Boulder. He had packed a thermos of coffee and driven us up in the pre-dawn darkness because he wanted to avoid the crowds. "I know I'm not easy to love," he said as the sun came up over the Rockies. "I know my life has to be quieter and more controlled than most people's, but you make me believe I can still have something beautiful. Will you marry me, Eleanor?" I said yes before he even finished the question. We married in October, a small ceremony at the courthouse, followed by dinner with close family and friends at the same quiet Italian restaurant where we had our first date. My mother cried happy tears. Rebecca and Margaret hugged me and whispered that they were proud of me for finding someone so good. Thomas's best friend from his ranger unit, a guy named Dave who also struggled with PTSD, was his best man. It felt perfect in its simplicity. I quit my job at the VA in November. Thomas and I had talked about it for weeks. He wanted me to come work for Second Wind, help him expand their services, maybe start a family program for veteran spouses who were also struggling. But more than that, he needed help managing his condition. His symptoms had been getting worse, he told me. The nightmares were more frequent, unexpected sounds were harder to handle. He needed our home to be a sanctuary, and he needed me to help create that. "I hate asking you to give up your career," he said one night, his voice rough with guilt. "But I don't know if I can do this without you. The nonprofit is growing, my symptoms are worse, and I just need help, El." I took his face in my hands. "You're not asking me to give anything up. We're building something together. That's what marriage is." So I left the VA. I started working from home for Second Wind, developing programming while also managing our household in a way that kept Thomas stable. I learned everything I could about trauma-informed care. I read books about complex PTSD, attended support groups for military spouses, created systems for our home that minimized triggers. No loud music, no unexpected visitors. 4th of July was spent inside with noise-canceling headphones and white noise machines. I learned to recognize the signs when he was sliding toward a flashback and how to gently guide him back to the present. Our sex life was tender and careful. Sometimes he would freeze up in the middle of intimacy, and I would hold him while he shook. "I'm sorry," he would whisper. "I'm so sorry." And I would tell him we had all the time in the world, that there was no pressure, that I loved him exactly as he was. We got pregnant in March, 8 months after the wedding. It wasn't planned, but we were both thrilled. Thomas cried when I showed him the test. "A baby," he kept saying. "We're going to have a baby." He immediately started planning how we would soundproof the nursery so sudden crying wouldn't trigger him, how we would need to prepare visitors about keeping voices down, how he would need to step away sometimes when the baby was too loud, but that didn't mean he loved her any less. I was so focused on managing his needs and preparing for motherhood that I missed things, little things that didn't quite add up. Like the time in April when I came home from the grocery store and could have sworn I heard the TV loud coming from our house. But when I walked in, Thomas was in his study with his noise-canceling headphones on, working quietly. "Did you have the TV on?" I asked. He looked confused. "You know I can't handle that volume, Elle." Or the time in May when our neighbor mentioned seeing Thomas at the hardware store, loading lumber into his truck. "Big renovation project?" she had asked. But Thomas had told me he was at a support group that afternoon. When I mentioned it, he said the neighbor must have been confused. You know how people misremember things. Or the fact that his best friend Dave never seemed to be around anymore, even though they had been inseparable. When I asked about it, Thomas said Dave was going through a rough patch and had asked for space. By June, I was 6 months pregnant and completely immersed in preparing for our daughter's arrival. My mother had softened toward me, excited about her upcoming grandchild. My sisters threw me a shower, a very quiet, small shower at Thomas's request. Everything in our life revolved around managing his PTSD and building a stable environment for our baby. And then came the 4th of July. Thomas had been anxious about it for weeks. Independence Day was always his worst day of the year, he said. The fireworks, the loud celebrations, the military displays, it all triggered him catastrophically. We had planned to spend it at a friend's cabin in the mountains, far from the noise. But that morning, I woke up with severe cramping and my doctor wanted me to come in immediately, concerned about possible preterm labor. Thomas was apologetic but firm. "I can't go to the hospital with you, Elle. 4th of July at a VA hospital? I'll have a complete breakdown. Can your sister take you?" So Rebecca picked me up and took me to the hospital. It turned out to be Braxton Hicks contractions, nothing serious, just my body practicing. The doctor told me to rest, stay hydrated, and I would be fine. Rebecca drove me home around 2 in the afternoon. As we pulled up to our house in Boulder, I noticed immediately that Thomas's truck was gone. Probably went to the cabin early, I thought, to get away from the noise. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire coming from the direction of the public shooting range about a quarter mile from our house. "Sounds like people are getting their patriotism on early," Rebecca joked. I thanked her and went inside, feeling exhausted. I made myself some tea and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the mountains. And that's when I saw it. The shooting range was visible from our kitchen window if you looked at the right angle. And there, clear as day, was Thomas, my husband, the man who claimed loud noises sent him into crippling panic attacks. He was wearing his favorite flannel shirt, shooting a rifle, laughing and talking with a group of guys I didn't recognize. As I watched, frozen in disbelief, he high-fived one of them after hitting a target. I watched for 5 full minutes, my pregnant belly pressed against the kitchen counter, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. He looked happy, relaxed, normal. He looked like someone who had never had PTSD in his life. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and texted him, "Come home, now." The reply came 15 minutes later, at the cabin already, heading inside. "Fireworks starting soon, going offline, love you." He was lying to me. He was at the shooting range, and he was lying to me. I didn't text back. I stood in our kitchen, 7 months pregnant, and felt my entire reality cracking open. He came home around 6 that evening, looking appropriately drained and stressed. "The drive up was terrible," he said, kissing my forehead. "How did your appointment go? Is the baby okay?" I stepped back from him. "You weren't at the cabin." Something flickered across his face. "What?" "I saw you, Thomas, at the shooting range. I stood at our kitchen window and watched you shoot for 20 minutes. You looked like you were having the time of your life." The silence that followed felt like falling. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Eleanor, I can explain. You've been lying to me." My voice was surprisingly steady. "About all of it, haven't you?" He sank into a chair at our kitchen table, his face in his hands. When he looked up, I saw something I had never seen before in his eyes. Not panic, not trauma, just plain, human guilt. "I do have PTSD, he said quickly. "Elle, I swear to you, I do. I have nightmares. I have triggers." But he stopped, struggled. "But it's not as severe as I told you." I exaggerated. A lot. I felt like I was floating outside my own body. Exaggerated. After my ex-girlfriend left me when I came back from deployment, I got paranoid. She said she loved me, but the second things got hard, she bailed. So when I met you, he looked down. I made myself seem more broken than I am. I wanted to see if you would stay anyway, if you would love me at my worst. Your worst, I repeated numbly. Our entire life is designed around managing your condition. I quit my job. We can't have people over. We missed my niece's birthday party last month because you said the noise would destroy you. I tiptoe around our own home. And you're telling me it was a test? I was going to tell you, he said desperately. Before the wedding, but you were so happy, and then your family was so proud of you for landing a guy like me, and I thought after we were married, after things settled, I could just gradually get better. You'd think it was treatment working, and we'd just move forward. And the pregnancy? I asked, my hands protective over my belly. When exactly were you planning to tell me before our daughter was born? Today, he said, and I almost laughed at the absurdity. I swear, Elle, I was going to tell you today. That's why I went to the range I needed to clear my head, figure out how to explain. Dave has been telling me for months I needed to come clean. He stopped hanging around because he couldn't watch me lie to you anymore. I walked to our bedroom and pulled out a suitcase. What are you doing? Thomas followed me, panic in his voice now, real panic, not performed. Eleanor, please, let's talk about this. Get out! I didn't look at him. Get out of this house right now. This is my house too. Get out or I'm calling the police and telling them I don't feel safe. I turned to face him, and whatever he saw in my expression made him step back. You manipulated me into quitting my job, into restructuring my entire life, into believing I was married to someone who needed me, when really you were just testing me like some kind of experiment. Get out of my house. He left. I heard his truck start up, heard it drive away, and then I sat on our bed, the bed where we had whispered about our future, where he had held me through my own nightmares about childbirth, and I cried until I thought I would be sick. My sister Rebecca came over that night. I had called her, barely able to explain, and she had come immediately. He lied about having PTSD? She asked, horrified. No, he has it. He just made it seem so much worse than it is. Our entire marriage is based on me managing a condition that's apparently manageable on his own. Elle, she said carefully, did you ever consider that maybe you needed to be needed? I looked at her sharply. What? You've always been the helper, the fixer, social work, the VA, even your relationship with Mom. You're always trying to prove you're valuable by helping people. Maybe that's why you fell for him. Because he gave you a purpose. I wanted to argue, but the words stuck in my throat. Was she right? Had I been so desperate to be essential to someone that I had missed all the red flags? Rebecca stayed with me that night. Thomas called 17 times. I didn't answer. The next morning, I woke up to an email from someone named Dave Thomas's former best friend. Eleanor, it read. Thomas told me what happened. I'm sorry. I should have said something months ago. He does have PTSD, but it's mild. Manageable with therapy and occasional bad days. Nothing like what he told you. He told me he was protecting himself from getting hurt again. I told him he was being a coward and a liar. He stopped talking to me because I threatened to tell you myself. I'm sorry I didn't. You deserve to know. I forwarded the email to Thomas without comment. 2 weeks went by. I stayed with Rebecca, tried to figure out what I wanted. My mother was furious when she found out not at Thomas, but at the situation. You're 7 months pregnant, Eleanor. You can't just throw away your marriage because he exaggerated his problems. He's a war veteran. For God's sake. He lied to me, Mom. Everyone lies, she said impatiently. The question is whether you love him enough to forgive it. Did I? I honestly didn't know. Thomas sent me a letter, a physical letter, handwritten, 15 pages long. In it, he laid out everything. Yes, he had PTSD diagnosed real, but rated at 30% disability by the VA, not the severe, debilitating version he had portrayed. He had nightmares about twice a week, not every night. Loud noises startled him but didn't send him into panic attacks. He could function in normal environments with minimal accommodation. He told me about his ex, Stephanie, who had promised to marry him, and then left 3 months after he got back from deployment. Not because of his PTSD, because she had fallen in love with someone else and used his condition as an excuse. I felt like the war had made me unlovable, he wrote. Like any woman who stayed would only stay out of pity. So when I met you, I made myself worse than I was. I wanted to see if you would choose me, even if I was broken. I wanted to control the narrative so I could never be blindsided again. The letter ended. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I need you to know that everything else was real. My love for you is real. My excitement about our daughter is real. My respect for the person you are is real. I didn't lie about any of that, and if you give me a chance, I will spend the rest of my life proving it. I read that letter 10 times, crying each time. My sister Margaret, ever practical, said, "Okay, so he lied about the severity of his condition. But Elle, you loved him. You chose to quit your job and work for his nonprofit. You chose to create a quiet home. Maybe those choices weren't entirely based on a lie. Maybe they were based on who you wanted to be in a partnership. Was she right?" I thought about the work I did for Second Wind. I loved it. I loved helping veterans find resources, loved developing programs that made a difference. I thought about our quiet evenings, our deep conversations, the way Thomas listened to me like I was the most interesting person in the world. Had all of that been fake? 3 weeks after he left, I agreed to couples therapy. Not because I had decided to forgive him, but because I didn't know what else to do. Our baby was due in 6 weeks. I needed to figure out if I could co-parent with this man, let alone stay married to him. Our therapist's name was Dr. Chen. She specialized in trauma and relationships, and she didn't pull punches. In our first session, she looked at Thomas and said, "What you did was manipulative and cruel. You took away your wife's ability to consent to the real relationship. You need to own that completely." Thomas, to his credit, did. He didn't make excuses. He didn't minimize. He looked at me and said, "I stole 2 years of honest partnership from us. I'm sorry." But then Dr. Chen turned to me. "Eleanor, I want you to think about something. Why did you fall in love with Thomas?" "Because he was honest," I said immediately. "Vulnerable. Real. Was he?" she asked gently. "Or was he a project? A purpose? A way to prove to your mother and yourself that you were choosing a meaningful life?" I wanted to deny it. But sitting in that office, I realized she was right. I had fallen in love with the idea of loving someone broken. It made me feel noble, necessary, important. "You both used each other," Dr. Chen said. "Thomas used you to prove he was lovable despite his trauma. You used Thomas to prove you were valuable because of your helping. Neither of you entered this marriage as whole people looking for a partner. You entered it as wounded people looking for validation. That session broke something open in both of us. Over the next 4 weeks, we unpacked everything. Thomas told me the real extent of his PTSD, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the anniversary reactions that hit him every year around the date he lost his friend in combat. They were real struggles, just not the all-consuming crisis he had portrayed. I told him about my desperate need to be essential to someone, about how I had never felt good enough for my mother, about how being the woman who loved a broken hero made me feel special for the first time. "I do love you," Thomas said in one session. "That was never a lie. But I loved you in a scared, controlling way. I need to learn to love you in a whole, trusting way." "I love you too," I admitted. "But I loved you as a therapist, not as a wife. I need to learn to love you as a partner, not a patient." Dr. Chen gave us homework. Thomas had to tell me one hard truth about himself every day, not about his PTSD, but about his real self. His fears, his dreams, his actual limitations. I had to do one thing every day that was just for me, not in service of anyone else. Our daughter was born on a warm September morning. We named her Grace. Thomas was in the delivery room, and when he held her for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes, not performed, not exaggerated, just honest human fear of not being good enough for this tiny life. "I'm scared I'm going to screw this up," he whispered. "Me too," I said, and it felt like the first truly honest thing we had said to each other in our entire relationship. We didn't move back in together immediately. I stayed with Rebecca for 2 months after Grace was born. Thomas came over every day, helped with feedings and diapers, sat with me while I cried from exhaustion and hormones. Slowly, carefully, we built something new. We went back to couples therapy every week. Dr. Chen had us write letters to each other, not apologies, but descriptions of the marriage we actually wanted. Thomas wrote about a partnership where he could be himself, flawed and healing but not performing helplessness. I wrote about a partnership where I could be supportive without losing myself. When Grace was 3 months old, we moved back in together. But this time, we did it differently. We didn't make our home a fortress against triggers. We made it a normal house where a baby cried and doors slammed and life was messy and loud. Thomas learned to manage his real symptoms without exaggerating them. I learned to pursue my own interests without needing to be constantly needed. It wasn't perfect. Thomas had bad days where the nightmares were worse or an unexpected sound made him jumpy. I had days where I slipped back into caretaker mode and had to consciously step back. We both had to learn that loving someone doesn't mean fixing them or being fixed by them. It means showing up, honest and whole, even when it's hard. I went back to work when Grace was 6 months old, not for second wind for myself. I got a position at a different VA hospital, part-time, doing the work I loved. Thomas hired a proper team for his nonprofit instead of relying on me to hold it together. We learned to be separate people who chose to be together, rather than enmeshed people who couldn't function apart. Now, 30 years later, I can tell you this: forgiveness isn't a moment, it's a practice. There were days, even years later, when I would remember standing at that kitchen window watching him shoot and feel the betrayal all over again. There were days when Thomas would catch himself about to exaggerate a symptom and have to consciously stop himself. But we chose each other every day. Not the fantasy versions we had created, but the real, flawed, human versions. Grace is 29 now. She's a therapist herself, specializing in relationship counseling. She jokes that growing up, watching her parents go to therapy every week, made it her calling. Thomas and I still see Dr. Chen once a month, even after all these years. Not because we're in crisis, but because we learned that honest communication requires practice. My mother passed away 10 years ago. Before she died, she told me something I'll never forget. "I was wrong to pressure you about marriage," she said, "but I was right that you needed to find your person. I just didn't understand that finding them is only the beginning. Building a real partnership with them, that's the work of a lifetime." She was right. Thomas still has PTSD. Real, manageable, sometimes difficult PTSD. I still have the urge to fix things, to be needed, to prove my value through helping. But now we see these patterns in each other and ourselves, and we call them out with kindness. Last week, our grandson was born. Grace and her husband brought him home from the hospital, and as I watched Thomas hold this tiny person, I thought about that 4th of July 30 years ago, about how close I came to walking away, about how that betrayal, that terrible, painful revelation, forced us both to become people capable of real love. I don't tell this story to justify what Thomas did. What he did was wrong, manipulative, hurtful, and I don't tell it to suggest everyone should forgive that kind of deception. I tell it because sometimes the worst moments in our lives crack us open in ways that let the light in. Sometimes the thing that almost destroys us is also the thing that forces us to become who we were always meant to be. Thomas and I didn't have a fairy tale. We had a false start, a painful revelation, and decades of hard work. But what we have now is real, earned, built on truth instead of fantasy. And 30 years later, I can finally say it was worth it. Not because what he did was okay, but because what we built from the ashes of that lie became something neither of us could have created from a false foundation. Grace asked me once, when she was in college, if I ever regretted not leaving. I thought about it for a long time before answering. No, I told her, but only because we both chose to do the work. If your father hadn't been willing to look at himself honestly, or if I hadn't been willing to examine my own patterns, I would have regretted staying every single day. The work made the difference. She nodded, understanding in a way only someone raised by people doing that work could understand. So here's what I want you to know, whoever you are, listening to this story. Love isn't enough. Trust isn't disposable. And forgiveness isn't owed. But if both people are willing to get brutally honest, to do the work, to show up imperfect and real and committed, sometimes, you can build something from broken pieces that's stronger than what you started with. Just know that it's hard, it takes years, and not every relationship deserves that effort. But mine did, and I'm grateful, 3 decades later, that I gave it a chance to become real.